This is why your relationships feel harder the more successful you become. There's something that very few people say out loud, but many certainly experience. And that's the more externally successful life becomes, the more complicated relationships can start to feel. It's not always in an obvious way, and there doesn't need to be big conflict or distance or anything dramatic happening. In fact, on the surface, things can look perfectly fine, but internally, something feels slightly harder to access, less natural and less effortless than it once did. And that can be quite difficult to articulate because nothing is technically wrong, but something feels very different. And the assumption that most people make here is usually incorrect. They assume that it's about time or stress or simply being too busy. And whilst those things can contribute, they don't fully explain what's actually going on. Because even when you manage to create time, even when space is available, and even when pressure is reduced, the same internal difficulties can still remain. So something else is involved here, and it's to do with how your internal system is organizing itself under sustained responsibility and success. Because over time, success doesn't just change your external environment, it changes your internal posture. The way you hold yourself, the way you scan situations, the way you anticipate outcomes. And in many cases, that internal posture becomes more structured, more self-managed, which works extremely well in professional situations, in goal-oriented environments. But in relationships, it doesn't quite operate with the same logic. They don't respond to structure in the same way. They respond to presence, to openness, to emotional availability. And that's where this tension can begin to form, because the same part of you that is highly efficient at managing complexity can also be the part of you that is subtly trying to manage emotions and expectations in your relationships. And it's not deliberate or obvious, but consistent enough to shape how connection is felt. Now, what I mean by this is quite simple. When you're used to holding responsibility, your system tends to stay slightly ahead of experiences. It anticipates, it evaluates, it tracks what's happening and what might happen next. And that works very well when outcomes matter. But in relationships, that same mechanism can create distance from intimacy. Because instead of fully entering the moment, part of you is still observing it, still tracking it, still managing it in real time. And that creates a subtle separation, not between you and the other person exactly, but between you and the experience itself. Now, this isn't something that people usually notice directly. They notice the effects of it. Conversations feel slightly less fluid than they should. Emotional moments don't fully land like they should. And there's a sense of being present but also slightly elsewhere at the same time. And over time, that can reshape how connection feels to you. Now, there's another layer here that's also important to look at, because success often requires degrees of self-containment. You learn to regulate yourself internally. You try not to rely too heavily on external stability, to stay composed under pressure. And again, that's not a flaw. It's a very functional adaptation. But in relationships, too much containment can start to reduce emotional permeability, meaning less of what you feel is fully shared and less of what is shared is fully received. Not because a lack of care, but because the system is still partially in holding mode. Now, this is also where things can become a little bit confusing because externally nothing looks wrong. There may still be love, still commitment, still respect, but internally something feels slightly filtered, less direct, and maybe less unguarded. And that's often where people start to question what's actually happening. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet sense that something isn't as effortless as it once was. And I want to be very precise here. This isn't about becoming more emotionally expressive or trying harder in relationships or forcing more openness, because those approaches often operate at the wrong level. What's actually happening is more structural. It's about how much of your system is still in a state of management versus direct experience. Because the more a system is orientated towards managing life, the less available it is for simply being in it. And relationships require a different orientation entirely. They don't need optimization, they need access. And there's also something else that sits underneath this all, and it's slightly more subtle, because success often comes with an increased sense of internal responsibility, not just for outcomes, but for how things are maintained. And that can slowly extend into relationship space as well, where you begin to unconsciously manage emotional dynamics, smoothing things over, anticipating tension, preventing disruption before it fully forms. And again, none of this is intentional, it's learned, it is adaptive, but it has consequences, because relationships stop being fully spontaneous and start becoming slightly curated. And this definitely isn't about blame or fault or something needing to be fixed in a harsh way. It's about recognition, because once you see the patterns clearly, something important becomes possible. You start to notice when you're in acceptance and when you've shifted into management. And that distinction alone begins to change how relationships feel. Not immediately, but gradually, because what you're actually working with here isn't behavior, it's a state. And state determines how connection is experienced. In the next video, I want to go into something even more foundational, which is how underlying stress doesn't always show up in obvious anxiety, but instead as an inability to fully arrive in the present moment, and why that becomes the quiet background of so many high-functioning lives. If you want a more detailed breakdown of how this pattern shows up in relationships and how to begin shifting it at the level underneath behavior, click the link underneath this video. That's where I go deeper into this and explain how to work with the system directly rather than trying to improve communication on the surface.